Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, A Decade of Reflections on Corporate Water Management. My name is Victoria Knowles, and I look after the Strategy, Engagement and Water groups here at 2 Degrees. I'm delighted to welcome the presenters today. Nick Martin, Sustainability Practice Lead and Senior Consultant at Antea Group. Peter Penning, Water Stewardship Solution Leader and Senior Consultant at Antea Group. Ron Bosmeyer, Workstream Lead for Water Stewardship Water Specialist at Heineken Supply Chain, and Todd Swingle, Director of Environmental Strategy at Cummins Inc. After the presentations, we'll have just a few minutes at the end where you can ask questions. Before we start, I'd just like to remind you all that you can submit questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A box in the bottom right hand of your screen. Just type in your question and press send, and we'll wait until the end to answer as many as we can. Otherwise, if you have any technical difficulties during the presentation, use the chat box on the right-hand side and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Without any further delay, I'd like to hand over to Nick, who will get us started on today's presentation.
Thanks, Victoria. And thanks again to 2 Degrees for hosting this session. Very much appreciated. Welcome all and appreciate you joining us. I'm Nick Martin, Sustainability Practice Lead with Antea Group, based out here in Denver, Colorado. The idea behind this presentation was that Peter and I, along with 2 clients from Cummins and from Heineken, thought it would be interesting to reflect on our collective expertise and experience having worked within corporate water management and developing corporate water strategies over the past decades. Obviously we can't take an hour here and try to spell out a how-to. So what we've designed is what we feel is a really concise webinar, very easy to follow in terms of the structure, with the idea being is that we want to communicate our collective thoughts around 3 different areas. We're going to look at 3 challenges to implementing corporate water strategies and barriers. We want to look at 3 trending solutions, and then we want to look a little bit forward and say, what are those business risks and opportunities that are out there on the horizon? So we'll save some time, as Victoria mentioned at the end, for questions and answers. And what we've decided to do is try to tag team this presentation between the 4 of us. Peter's up bright and early in California, normally based out in Lisbon. I'm here in Denver. We've got Todd somewhere in China, struggling a little bit with connections, so hopefully he'll be able to join us, it looks like via Skype. And then we've got Ron at home, I believe, in Amsterdam. So with that in mind, look forward to a good session, and let me hand it off to my colleague, Peter Penning, to dive into our first of 3 barriers, looking at why water, why now.
All right, thank you. So why water and why now? It's the question that needs to be answered, because everybody knows that water has become a hot topic recently, and the reason why that is quite simply a physical reason. If you look at the diagram on the left-hand side of the slide, you see that our water consumption on the planet has been rising steadily, with the majority going to grow our food, which is obvious. Agriculture consumes about 3/4 of the amount of water that's available, and industry, private people, domestic use are also on the increase, of course, because basically there's more of us on this planet. We eat more food, and we need more water for both agriculture and industrial uses. So that amount has been growing. At the same time, it doesn't rain more. So if you look at the total amount of available water on this planet, that is sustainable. It is a renewable source, but the amount of water that is available for a long-term sustainable use is about 4,200 cubic kilometers. So that seems like an awful lot of water. But the issue is that if you look a little bit further to 2030, which is only 16 years from now, you will see that with the current linear growth of the water consumption on this planet, the agricultural, the pink part of the graph, the agricultural consumption alone will exceed the available water that we have on this planet. And remember, this is the renewable, the sustainable amount of water, so we can actually live and survive a little bit longer than just 2030. But the idea is that we will actually be then taking a mortgage on our children's future, because we'll be using water out of storage, what is already available in lakes, etc., etc. So If you then add the total amount of water that we will consume in 2030, you see that we have a 40% deficit. So that is quite a lot. And Nick, if we just move to the next slide. So now this will require action. You cannot possibly use 40% more of something without somebody somewhere taking some action. And this is what we're facing right now. So the question, why water, why now, is for you as business leaders. Where will the conservation happen? Will it be voluntary? Will it be mandatory? Will you get the government, your local authorities putting on all sorts of bans, restrictions? Look at your markets. Which markets will be most impacted? You see the United States, for example, where I'm currently. There's a lot of water consumption. It exceeds per capita way what, for example, a country like India is consuming. So you could expect in certain areas of that market different impacts than in other markets. What will that pressure look like? Will it be extra regulations? Will it be an increase in prices for your water? Will it just be like once a week we will shut you down, or we will start rotating between factories and things like that? And then of course the question that you all want to know. Even in the best case scenario, will water not be an issue? And I can sincerely tell you that is not the case. Water is already an issue in so many countries of the world, and all the things that I just mentioned to you are actually at play in various countries at this very moment. So right here, I'm in California, and there's all sort of talk about what's going to change and how the legal framework will change, and nobody really knows how. So with that big unknown and looking ahead for only 16 years, which is not a lot, we are in for some serious discussions and serious actions within every single company to be ready for the changing landscape. What I do want to stress with this particular slide is that this is not like oil. This is not running out. We're not running out of water. It will still be raining and snowing. That's 4,200 cubic kilometers on an annual basis. It is how we spread this water around between every single user on this planet. And that is the issue, and that will require some serious thought. And this is where businesses in particular need to be preemptive and start engaging right now, because you basically only have 16 years to work on this issue. And Nick, with that, I pass.
It's a good transition to our second barrier. So having felt the pressure, the concern, the potential to work on this as a company, the next step is how do we approach water? Do we have Todd on the line? I'm going to take that as a no. So what Cummins looked at, and they've had a culture of conservation in their company for quite some time, very heavy on energy conservation, energy management, and greenhouse gases, obviously being a engine manufacturing company that's always been a major focus, as well as conservation within their facilities around water and waste. What they did a few years back is when they started really looking at what should they be doing around water beyond just looking at conservation, and what does the strategy look like. It was a really interesting moment for them, because at first they thought, okay, we've got a very mature energy program. We can just simply replicate that, replicate similar standards, similar metrics, similar training, and we'll go on our way and we'll implement an equally successful water program. What they quickly realized as they started looking at water was there were some very fundamental differences. So on the energy side, we all know there's strong economic drivers. If you save energy, you save money. End of the day, plain and simple, move on and implement. On the water side, that's one of the challenges, is that there's not always that direct financial return on investment. But then they realized there were a lot of other aspects to water when they start really looking at their facilities, looking at the regulations, looking at the watershed as a whole in terms of infrastructure for water and the reliability of that infrastructure, looking at the transportation issues, the water quality issues. They started realizing that water was more complex, but it was also very, very localized in comparison to what they needed to do on the energy side within their operations. And And that really led them to want to spend a lot of time on water to better understand it before they moved too far too fast. And what they did is they really stepped back, and they were one of the first pilot companies to test the Series Aqua Gauge tool. And at the time, the tool was still a draft tool, and Cummins tested that tool. And what it is a way to look more holistically at what a strategy requires. So it's not just having standards, it's not just having metrics. You really got to look at the full picture of what you need to have a good, robust, and meaningful water strategy. And they used that tool to do a gap analysis several years ago, and since then they've methodically really filled in those gaps that they thought were the highest priorities, and it allowed them to really prioritize on what was going to matter to change their culture, change their operations, and really embrace water. It's pretty remarkable where they've come in the last couple of years. They've now got a strategy, as you see on the right side of this slide, that really has 4 elements to it. So fundamentally, water conservation is always going to be the highest priority. They have to manage their internal house within their 4 walls and be stewards of water, plain and simple, anywhere they are in the world. That's fundamental. And then beyond that, they're really looking at 3 kind of pillars of a strategy, where it's business operations, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this presentation. How can water impact business continuity and business operations? And are they resilient and prepared for the different impacts from extreme weather to supply reliability to changes in governance and regulations? The second one is really community alignment. So they've realized they could have perfect facilities and still have operational challenges and, more importantly, community challenges around water. So they've realized they've really got to engage the communities where they operate and be part of the solution. And that builds upon their standard foundation programs they've had in their company for decades now. And then the last one is looking at more holistically at their entire supply chain. So, what are the water impacts and water risks and opportunities from the sourcing of their raw materials all the way to the end of life of their engines and other products and services. And so what they've done is develop a complete program and complete water strategy that they've rolled out to their global operations, and then been able to prioritize where they have the greatest risks and greatest opportunities, and really hone in to make those changes first and foremost, but make sure that all facilities are taking water very seriously and putting it on an equal positioning as some of the other major issues in the environmental and sustainability space. Which is a good transition into our next slide, and I'd introduce Ron Bohmeyer from Heineken to talk about that prioritization and how they looked at what are their greatest risks and opportunities and how do they approach those. Ron?
Yes, thanks, Nick. Hi, everybody. This is the voice of Ron Bohmeyer from Heineken. Heineken is one of the most world international brewers. Apart from the Heineken brand, we have about 250 brands of beers, ciders, and other beverages in our portfolio. We operate about 170 production facilities in more than 70 countries. So brewers use water in their finished product. A beer is more than 95% water, or nearly 95% water. But also in the rest of our supply chain, water is vital for the operations. So one can imagine that water risks score high on our risk radar. The water is one of the 4 focus areas of our sustainability strategy, and we really understand the critical importance of sustainable use and the protection of water to safeguard the critical resource. A couple of years we started with a series of water footprint studies in different markets, that we got a good idea of where and when in our supply chain we were most dependent on water. As we cannot work everywhere at the same time, the first step was to prioritize the production units according to water-related risks. The idea was to subsequently reduce the level of granularity of the investigations according to the risk level. And for this first screening effort, we used the publicly available water mapping tools like the Global Water Tool, Aqueduct, the risk filter of WWF. These databases are summarizing water availability, water stress, and other information on water-related risks. This screening enabled us to gain, say, a high-level first indication of the water risk. And we identified red flag conditions. We could make a priority list with priority 1, priority 2, and priority 3 sites. And for each priority level, we introduced a different next phase. Now, our priority 1 sites are unambiguously facing water-related risks. All indicators of the different models are pointing in the same direction. And the next step for every priority 1 site is to dive deeper in the matter and implement a source water protection program and to balance the water that the facility does not return to the local watershed. In a later stage of this presentation, I will come back to our water balancing program. But the situation at our priority 2 sites is not so clear. According to some of the models, the area of the facility is facing water risks, but others indicating differently. For these sites, we developed in close collaboration with Antea a water risk screening survey that aims for an assessment of physical risks today, over 5 years, and for an horizon post-2025. And we did this together with a more rigorous examination of the regulatory and the reputational water-related risks of our sites. And in this analysis, we integrated the vision and the risk perception of local management with the outcome of the global models. Now, the outcome of this evaluation determines how we will continue with priority 2 sites. Or they are considered to be at risk, and then they become a priority 1 site with all related work and protective actions, or they will become priority 3 sites, which can implement a lighter source water protection program. Now, further to you, Nick.
Thanks, Ron. That's a good transition as well. So we're going to shift into 3 of our trending solutions we want to highlight, which really builds upon how do you overcome the barriers to start thinking about what really has worked with a number of companies. The first of which gains a lot of attention, is one of the early and really ongoing obstacles with water stewardship is that water is historically perceived as being undervalued and underpriced. I say perceived; it is in a lot of areas, in my expert opinion. I often and kind of unfortunately joke that I think I pay 3 to 4 times as much for cable and internet at home than I do for water. And I currently live in a relatively water-challenged area in Colorado. So you start to see these trends of looking at water pricing. There are 2 really areas where this comes into play from our experience, and why we've positioned it as the first of the trending solutions. As illustrated on this slide, on the left side of the slide, it really looks at what you are paying for water as a company and the way you look at that price you pay. We like to look at this in 4 areas when we work with clients. The first area, and is often the most intuitive, is what you think you currently pay. And often we find that companies and facilities, they only really look at the cost that they pay directly to a water supplier. Or in some cases where they have their own wells, they often perceive water being a free resource. In reality, there's some other costs that we say you actually pay that we feel are very tangible, very direct costs. This takes into account the water has to be transported to and from the facilities, as well as between the different process steps within your facility. In order to transport water, you obviously need electricity or fuel, which has a cost you could apply or attach to that. Water needs to be treated with chemicals or other treatment methods, filters, etc. There's a cost involved. And then the other one often is water has to be heated and cooled, which again, you have to use electricity and fuel to heat and cool water, which has a direct cost and a meaningful cost to it. So when you take that into account, you can very easily say, that's what you actually pay today. We also like to take it 2 other steps with a lot of clients where we say, okay, what might you pay? Beyond the 2 to 3 times what you think you pay in the actual cost, what are some other categories of cost that also could, kind of compound that and be added onto that? In this bucket, we often look at, water-related maintenance costs. So there's a lot of maintenance that is really related to water process steps, either the treatment and filter cleaning, filter removal and replacement, maintenance of different process steps and the transport of water and heating and cooling boilers, cooling towers, etc. You also have regulatory fee costs. Think about permits, licensing, sewer fees. Unfortunately, compliance violations have a cost to them. And then there's things like contingency plans and reporting and community engagement. Those are all related to water and the way you implement your water strategies and, have actual business costs to them. The last bucket we like to look at is more the future projections. What could you pay in the future? And this could be as simple as evaluating inflation and water pricing increases. So what if our water prices went up 10% per year? But more often, we've been starting to work with a lot of clients on scenarios where they start to look at what if we have insufficient water supplies? What is the production loss potentially in terms of our growth plans? And that has a direct, bottom line impact to a lot of companies, especially in these key markets where they're trying to grow their businesses. If you take that into account and think about the true cost of water, you then can shift to the right side of the slide where the other trend we're starting to see is a lot of stakeholders are looking at broader concepts beyond just price versus cost to really look at the value of water. So this is looking at the value of water not only from the company perspective, but also from the local community and the ecosystem. So you often hear a lot about natural capital costs and payment for ecosystem services. Some of those terms are being, kind of tossed around a lot more frequently now. And it really has some potential implications on a business. So, if you start looking at the value of water to everybody within a watershed, that kind of context starts looking at how do you then define who the priority users are, who they should be, and then looking at potentially reallocating water rights based upon the value of water versus, how it's being used. Can also have implications for water usage restrictions and more stringent discharge limits when the value is better understood. And then lastly, obviously, there could be a direct tie to adjusting water pricing schemes to better reflect the true cost of providing the water and then the true value of that resource to the end user and to the customer. Fundamentally, this is a really important concept because implementing water strategies are often very challenged with meeting investment hurdle rates. So with a low cost of water, it's very hard to justify investments within a lot of companies. But looking at a more true cost of water or ultimately some of these water valuation studies can really help you better defend what you're trying to push within your companies and how you're trying to approach water when there isn't that direct payback like you've probably experienced on the energy side. So considering the true cost and then the broader value considerations, this is going to become really more important in meeting your objectives, especially as Peter alluded to, the resource becomes more and more stressed. As the quote on the slide points out, we'll never know the worth until the well runs dry. You see this in a lot of resources. As it becomes more stressed, the price goes up. It's a natural economic phenomenon, you might say. But this is going to be very important, and that's why we presented it as kind of the first of the solutions out of our 3. So we need to keep moving on here. The next one I'd pass it off to with the second solution would be back to my colleague Peter Penning to look at the understanding local conditions. Peter?
All right. Okay. So when you have 2 facilities in 2 different areas of the world, we like to use the watershed, so the area that the water is coming from as our measurement basis. So we look at water on a watershed basis. If you would just look at a country like the Netherlands and you would look at the greater Nairobi area, which are in a physical sense quite different, you would say. One is on the equator, the other one is in the northern temperate zone. But if you just look at the amount of water that falls in the area, the amount of people that are living in that area, you would, if you just did an overall assessment, okay, how much water do we have and how much is that per person, it would come down to roughly the same amount of water. So that wouldn't do it. So you need a lot more to make that the difference. And you know there is a difference intuitively. You know you can't compare Nairobi to the Netherlands. So what are those differences? And we found that over the last 10 years or so that we did this work, that you need to look at a number of factors to make sure that you do what is right for that particular area and what is right for your company. We found that, looking just at the natural context, how much water is there, where does the river go to, are there ways of storing water, et cetera, that is just one aspect. What we did find to be extremely important is what other stakeholders are in that area, because more often than not, companies come in the news about their excessive use of water, et cetera. It's not about what they really do. It's what they are perceived to be doing, what the stakeholders in that area think they are doing. We've all read, the likes of Pepsi and Coca-Cola getting into trouble around this, and it's not that they actually did something wrong. What was happening was that they perceived to be doing something wrong, and in this case, they were perceived to be taking water away from other users. So getting a picture of that stakeholder map in the area is very important. What we also see, and if you look back at the Netherlands and Nairobi, similar amount of people, all sort of NGOs that are active in the Netherlands that are also active in Nairobi area, vice versa. But what we see there as a big difference is the regulatory framework. So whereas the Netherlands have been a stable democracy for now more than a century now, Nairobi just relatively recently, came out of a dictatorship. So they've been run as more or less the personal fief of one president, basically ignoring a lot of rights of the people in that country. And what is happening now that it's a more mature democracy, those people that did not have access to water are getting access to water, and rightly so. And what we found out there is that the actual new rules and regulations and the whole drive to provide access to water to the larger part of the community is now impinging on the natural ability to supply that water. So there, the whole situation is now, we're doing something right, and it's creating an effect on the natural environment. And now we have to go back again to those stakeholders and come up with proper solutions. And where business sits in all of this is that if you are a large company in that Nairobi area, and there are quite a few of those, and if you're dependent on water, you see that your water is going to be taken away from you and given to somebody else who is also very deserving of that water, and that all within a natural limiting context. So there, the difference is that the whole landscape is changing. So if you don't know that, if you just look at the amount of rainfall in a particular area and the number of people that are living in that area, you don't know enough. If you just limit yourself to, for example, looking if or not there is any groundwater to use, again, you are limiting yourself. So we found that it's incredibly important to look at the whole picture. And more often than not, we are not using hydrogeologists or other scientific experts to do this kind of assessment, because we find that it's in the softer, for lack of a better word, in the softer parts of this assessment that we need to put our efforts, because it is that stakeholder assessment. Who is doing what and what for? What are their drivers? What are the reasons why they do it? What's happening in the regulatory framework? What direction is this going? Which is more often than not also more important than just knowing what the current rules are, because where is this government going? What are the investments going to be to provide water to a certain area? So that's very, very, very typical of an assessment that we do. And if you do not do this kind of assessment for your facilities that are in water-stressed areas, you have very little to base your decisions on. You don't know where everything is going. You don't know who to talk to. And if, for example, in the case of Heineken, and Ron will talk more about it, if you want to do something positive, if you want to contribute to an area that is water stressed, you need to know all these things. You need to know what the natural context is, obviously, but you need to add that deep knowledge about what stakeholders want, what the potential partners are, within what kind of regulatory framework are you working. And all that needs to also fit your own business, which is another part that a lot of purely technical studies seem to forget, is that where does it all fit in the business, right? And then how do you ensure that your business can use water sustainably for the longer term? Because you put down the facility for decades. You don't put it down for a year. You put it down for decades. So this is kind of what we learned. We've done this kind of work all over the world, and sometimes you're amazed and you're surprised how in areas that you would not expect from a natural point of view to have any issues, that come in, the stakeholders come in, the regulatory framework come in, sometimes the lack of investment by local authorities. You end up in really strange situations. So some islands where in the Indian Ocean, where it rains almost 4,500 millimeters per square meter per year, which is a lot of water. That's a column of 4.5 meters. Those islands are water stressed because nobody captures all that water and actually does something useful with it. It just flushes into the sea. And then there's other areas where a fraction of that water falls, and people are managing just fine with that limited amount. And that is nothing to do with the natural context. It's all to do with how the authorities and the regulatory framework work. So it's very interesting once you have that full insight what you can do, and what the basis for your decision making improves so much. But it's essential that you look at this from a multi-level, a holistic, as I like to call it, a holistic point of view, because that will give you the right basis for action. It's pointless to go into a reforestation project if the whole natural context is not helping you with that. If there's no regulation that provides some protection to those trees, and if the stakeholders are really interested in something else, you need to, in a way, go with the flow. And with that, I would like to pass.
Yeah, that's a good lead into Ron Bomeyer again, talking about their redressing the balance of community engagement work. They used a very similar approach to really focus on where do we want to do work and what exactly, as Peter mentioned, do we want to work on to have some meaningful impact. Ron?
Okay, thanks, Nick. In the next two slides, I will present some examples of our water balancing portfolio. We at Heineken consider water balancing as a solid method to mitigate our longer-term water risks. And we made a commitment that in water-scarce areas, Heineken will balance the water that the facilities do not return to the local watershed. And that is the water that we put in our product, and say the unavoidable losses like evaporation and the moisture in the byproduct. That water cannot be reused by the users downstream the facility. In our view, sustainable water management deals with communication and cooperation. Water is the ultimate shared resource and everybody's responsibility. In our view, water balancing is a commitment to sustainable management of shared water resources in the local watershed through collective actions with other business, with government, NGOs, and communities. Water is everybody's business. And water balancing can be effectuated by supporting or participating in projects working on the following three objectives. Or the project should improve agricultural water conservation, storage or reuse, or reduce agricultural pollution. And we start these projects only in those watersheds where, say, we locally source and where we have a direct role on the commodities that we purchase. Another type of project is ecosystem rehabilitation. Projects that are based on the concept that natural ecosystems and conservation management upstream to the facility can help to provide a clean, regular supply of water and mitigate the effects of flash floods. Or a third type of project that should provide better access to water for the local population. Although in our view, governments are always responsible to address water scarcity, but in our view, the private sector can play a role in helping to strengthen capacity to create stronger institutions and a broad stakeholder engagement. These three types of projects are valuable to Heineken because they help to mitigate water-related risks, support sustainable business growth, protect our reputation, and build stronger local stakeholder relationships. Now, the first example that we see here is the example of the Harar Brewery. In Harar, Ethiopia, the brewery supports a public-private partnership, sustainable water services for Harar city. The focus area of this public-private partnership is to provide better access to water for the local population. The project is realized in collaboration of several stakeholders in the local watershed, the local government, the Harar Town Water Supply and Sewage Authority, the local university, NGOs, and some members of the private sector. This project is managed by Vitens Evides. It's a Dutch water supply company which works overseas also. And the major funding originates from the Dutch government and from the Harare People Regional State. This project aims to ensure long-term water availability for urban, rural, and industrial consumers in the area. In our view, the project develops an integrated water resource allocation, and we try to conserve water wherever possible in the watershed. We will try to initiate several sustainable abstraction practices and water conservation approaches like rainwater harvesting, small dams, simple practices which may help to store more water in the watershed. And in Mexico, another example of our portfolio, can you continue? Yeah? We try to redress the water balance by participating in the Monterrey Water Fund. Our brewery in Mexico, in Monterrey, joined the consortium with other companies, universities, civil societies, government institutions to establish the Monterrey Metropolitan Water Fund. And Monterrey is one of the most important industrial cities in Mexico. And since its foundation, the city suffered the effects of flooding, extreme droughts, with devastating consequences for people and their property. And the growth that Monterrey has experienced in recent years has put pressure on the watershed and created negative impacts on the quantity and quality of water in the area. Now, the Monterrey Water Fund was initiated and managed by the FEMSA Foundation, which is an important NGO in the area in the space of water conservation and ecosystem rehabilitation. Now, the Monterrey Water Fund provides a vehicle for large water users to make contributions focused on preserving the watershed of the San Juan River and thus ensuring the environmental services the city receives. The participants of the fund will create a seed fund, and this capital will be used in the stock market to generate income that will be used to finance the anticipated projects. So this Monterrey Metropolitan Water Fund will focus on the preservation of the watershed, which supplies more than 4 million people in and around Monterrey. And the 4 key objectives are helping to mitigate flooding, improving water infiltration and recharge in the area, to raise awareness about water, and to work alongside the government to attract resources which favor the watershed. As indicated before, in our view, healthy watersheds naturally regulate water flows. They release water in times of drought, holding and slowing down its flow in times of flood, filter out nutrients that are harmful to downstream users. The conservation actions will help reduce the disastrous consequences of the extreme natural events that happens in the area. In our view, these projects, these two example projects which I presented, are valuable to Heineken because they help to mitigate water-related risks. They support sustainable business growth, protect our reputation, and build stronger local stakeholder relationships. And we see these projects not as philanthropy, but we believe that they represent a solid business case for achieving sustainable flows and access to clean water for both the communities and for our facilities. Further to you, Nick.
Outstanding. Thanks, Ron. Those are two really good projects. So we will transition here into the last section of our presentation, where we wanted to not only look at the barriers, the solutions, but also try to give a flavor for what's out there on the horizon. What are those issues that companies really focused on water are starting to really feel the impact and starting to plan for as a potential business advantage as well? The first example here is from Cummins. I believe Todd can hear us, so if you want to say hi to him, you can do that, but it sounds like we cannot hear him. Is that correct, Todd?
Well, I'll try. Can you hear anything?
Very good. Hey.
I came through. Well, thank you very much. Sorry I missed the earlier section. As Nick mentioned, I'm in China, actually, working on a variety of water projects for our company. And the energy water nexus is something that people have talked about a lot, and it's really stemmed from a lot of the connections that exist between power production and water use out in the energy production sector. But within Cummins, we've found that there is significant linkage as well. Nick, on the slide, talks about making trade-off decisions, and that's one of the things that as we launched into our water program that we had fear of. But frankly, on the energy water nexus within our operations, we've found it quite the opposite, that most of the opportunities that we're assessing on the water programs are actually have benefits on the energy side as well. We very often see those as companion projects, which is very fortunate because, as Nick talked about earlier, trying to get projects that are purely water-oriented across the finish line with hurdle rates can be very challenging. But as we've started to look deeper into understanding what those true costs are and how energy savings are coupled with water savings, we've seen quite a bit of opportunities. One of the great ones for us has been this connection on engine testing. As you can imagine, with engines being about half of our business, we test a lot of engines all over the world. And this has typically been one of our biggest consumers of water. We, in many cases, have used water to load the engines using water brake dynos, and we've also used water for cooling systems on direct cooling on the engines and different portions of those. But as we've looked for water conservation opportunities, we've also seen that we have opportunities to couple these with using AC regenerative dynamometers. And for those of you that are not familiar with that, the concept there is that we're able to generate electricity off of running our engines and create that load at the same time. The benefit is we're not generating heat from those engines. Instead, we're generating electricity, so that's a positive. And we also see significantly lower water utilization, and because of this capturing the heat in a different form of energy. So those are an incredibly positive win-win scenario. And we see this all across the business. So another area that we've continually noted is in operation of our cooling systems. As you start to optimize cooling tower operation, minimizing evaporation in many cases has us pumping less water around, which has energy benefits. So as we've looked for opportunities, we see that connection more and more, and it really helps put projects across the finish line, be they energy or water, with and having those benefits that exist on both sides of the fence. Nick, if you want to move on to the, yep. So the other piece that has really become a major discussion point is supply reliability. And Nick talked about a quote earlier that was really good, is that you only know the value of water when you don't have it. And so this is a scenario that I walk through with our plants and our operators in many different locations around the world. Because the concept everywhere that I work has typically been that conservation is our answer. We need to just reduce the amount of water that we use, and we're doing the right thing. The problem with that type of approach is that if I have a process that uses 100,000 gallons a day and I reduce it to 50,000 gallons a day, that's a wonderful thing, and it's improved my load on the community. But if my supply is interrupted, whether I'm using 100,000 or 50,000 or 5,000 or 5 gallons, I'm out of business. And so from an operational reliability standpoint, then starting to look at resiliency is very, very important. And the answers are tied very much into the community, whether understanding what your possibilities for interruption are. Is it 1 hour? Is it 8 hours? Is it 24? What if that is 2 weeks? So understanding the implications and what your mitigation options are in order to protect your operations and business continuity, and how that links into supply reliability has been a key portion of our strategy. So as we look at conservation opportunities, at the same time, we're always asking the question, what is our dependency on water in those processes, and how does that correlate to the supply reliability that exists out in the community? So taking a look and looking at where our money can best be spent. Are we best looking at our own processes and eliminating dependency, or are we looking at supply storage on site, or are we working with the local utility to improve their capability to provide more reliable supplies? So, all of this really relates into we want to be good stewards of water, but there's a very strong business case that exists in discussing with, as you start to talk to your CEOs and CFOs, and putting this type of context around operational resiliency starts to get to the type of language that they understand.
Good. Thanks, Todd. Good. Appreciate you joining as well, so I didn't have to try to pronounce your engine testing technology. So we're going to shift to the second risk and opportunity category that we put in here. And, I've entitled this Perfect Storm Pressures. So, water is a really unique business issue, as we've talked to previously. And, I look at it as kind of having what I'd call the perfect storm conditions to make this an even more challenging issue for companies to manage, both internally and then looking at it from an external communications and social license to operate kind of perspective. There are three conditions we have highlighted here on the slide that I think in my mind make this really critical, and especially when you consider the combined implications of these three conditions. The first one is, as Peter spoke to at kind of length earlier, is, water really is a critical resource. So nearly everything we touch on a daily basis requires some degree of water to either make it, move it, use it, dispose it, recycle it, etc. And, everybody's probably seen those studies that try to, and the infograms or the little graphics that, try to discuss the embedded use of water within a product. Be it a cup of coffee, a hamburger, a pair of tennis shoes, various products, you've probably seen that. The fact is that we use a lot of water. And as population and global development continues, Many experts are predicting we're going to have significant gaps. Like Peter mentioned, the 40% gap earlier. And this is going to be most notable in a lot of the most populated and developing areas around the world, including China and India. Unfortunately, many of these areas and many companies, where the greatest pressures are is also where they have their key growth markets and a majority of their focus. So it's going to increasingly be a real challenge from a critical resource standpoint. The second condition is that we live in the age of transparency. Everybody's aware of social media and all the access to information that we have this day, which is fairly unprecedented. With the combination of Google Maps and then publicly available and more sophisticated water mapping tools, you've got the WRI Aqueduct Water Atlas, the Global Water Tool, the Water Footprint Network, etc. Nearly anyone with a little bit of interest and a little bit of free time on their hands could really do their own assessment of a company. It's not hard to go out and find locations and then get a sense of, what the different water risks are based upon those locations. And there's more and more water data available as this has become a bigger issue. There's better data than ever before. It's not, everywhere in the world, and it's hit and miss, but more and more there's access to good data. And this kind of leads to the third condition, which is really looking at corporate expectations. There's been a real growth in expectations around water, from shareholder resolutions to some companies acknowledging water as a risk within their SEC and other types of risk filings. Investor requests like CDP water disclosure, to also having more and more documented methodologies about how companies should report on water, their usage, their impacts, their risks. CEO Water Mandate's a really good example. They put out a corporate reporting methodology essentially for companies, which is very detailed and very practical and applicable, which raises the expectation that companies will follow these guidelines and use these types of guidelines. And this last condition with expectations has not only led to greater transparency, but there's also increased accountability and expected level of engagement for companies to be part of the solution, as you probably noticed through a lot of our slides, within the local watersheds, and not just looking at your four walls of operations and your own water use. Companies are increasingly viewed as kind of a key stakeholder to addressing water issues, both on a global scale and more on a local scale. It kind of puts them in that rock and a hard place kind of proverbial position. And, whether that's fair or not is highly debatable, but, the reality is that many stakeholders know what companies are capable of and have witnessed what, applying pressure can do to really drive company action, whether that pressure comes from an investor, from a stakeholder, from an NGO, or from an activist. There's many case studies out there of what that can do to drive real change within a company, and trigger them to implement advanced strategies. Many companies in return, and a lot of our clients are realizing that they can be more proactive and that they kind of see the writing on the wall around water and around local engagement, that they'd rather alleviate any negative issues, and they're starting to really see some tremendous business value. As you've seen with the examples from Cummins and Heineken, they've really embraced this as a competitive advantage in a lot of ways and the right way to do business. With that, it's a good transition into our last slide here that really looks at how do you manage locally, and why do we put that as one of the horizon risks and opportunity areas, with companies taking a fit-for-watershed approach is how we've termed it. Peter, for our last slide.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So as they always say, an optimist will think that it will all blow over, and a pessimist think that the end of time has come, and a realist will actually plan for what's ahead. And that's what is needed. So you need to come up with a plan. You need to devise a plan that covers not only your facility, but the wider watershed. And every watershed is different, as Nick rightly said. So what you need to do is you start with your own facility. You can't go out and into the world and claim all sorts of benefits. You need to clean up your own act before you do so. So when you're looking at your facilities, you need to have your own water conservation strategies. You need to have water teams. You need to have water champions or whatever you want to call it. Six Sigma teams. Work on your own processes and make them more efficient. And I saw some of the questions that were being asked are along those lines, and that makes perfect sense. You also need to make sure that you have a source water protection plan in place. You need to know where your water comes from and how that source is protected from any mishaps. But as we said earlier, you've done your homework. You know what's going on in your watershed. You know there are stakeholders and communities at play here. So you need to start looking at your stakeholders. You need to map them. You need to start engaging them, because these are not just enemies, they are your friends as well. So you need to identify who are the key stakeholders. You need to evaluate what their interests are, what they think is important, how they prioritize the things that they want to achieve. And then you need to establish appropriate relationships and partnerships. So Heineken, as Ron said, they can't do all this balancing on their own. And Ron indicated that, the Dutch government is a large part. There's a water provider in there. The local Ethiopian authorities are part of that whole exercise. And that's what stakeholder engagement does for you too. It helps you to build levers so that you can, have a little bit of force from your own side and achieve a bigger impact on the other side of the lever, right? That's what's important as well. And again, you need to do this in a structured way. You just can't go out, send, one or two people who have done, communications degrees into the wide world. That's why it needs to be tied back to that earlier research that you've done. You know what's important in the area, and you can target and plan for a focused stakeholder engagement. And then when you want to do something with the community, and both Cummins and Heineken are doing community projects, again, what is it that the community wants? What is it that concerns them? Make a proper evaluation. Look ahead. What do you think is going to happen in the near future? What are the demographic trends in the community you're working with? And then come up with effective community water projects. We've seen many instances where, I would call it dropping a solution onto a community where, without any regards to the local cultural circumstances and the cultural framework, a project gets done and it fails because it does not take into account that local culture. And again, tie back to what you know, what you've investigated and what you know about this particular watershed, the local people and the communities in that watershed, and make it effective and fit for purpose for that community. And then obviously you need to quantify the benefits. You need to look at things like water neutrality is a term that's been around for a long time. I think Heineken uses balancing, which I think is more accurate because it takes into account what they actually are doing. Neutrality kind of implies that you're looking at all the water that's involved, and we talked about this. There's a lot of water in everything that we do, so that may not be the right way forward. But what is it that you do? Define it accurately, measure it, and report it. It is important. If only if you report it internally, so you know what you're doing. If you don't measure, you might as well not do it, right? It gets you that focus and that way forward. So like I said, you need to make a plan. You need to make a plan that is for your own facility, for the stakeholders that are in that watershed, and for the communities that are in that watershed. So water is, unlike energy and carbon and climate change, it's a local issue. The water in a particular area, that's what you have, that's what you got to use, and it's not going to be affected by another area next door to it. So it has to be local. You need to look at every aspect, like your facility itself, the stakeholders, the community. It's all about ownership, engaging and involving. So it's internal and external. It's the same thing. You need to create that ownership. You need to get those people engaged that you want to work with and make sure that they are part of the solution, not just part of the problem. So once you've got this plan, it's tailor-made to your watershed. It's a local plan. You understand the local conditions. You implement it. You will see that you will have a lot less issues, and you will actually see also that you will be extremely effective in what you're doing, and it will not sort of come back to you as a boomerang. It's going to be an effective program. But like I said, when I started this particular part of the presentation, you cannot do this without a plan. You need to have a fit for purpose, watershed-based approach, and it needs to be thoroughly planned, including, what engineers always dread a little bit, the soft bits around stakeholders and communities. But in the case of watershed management, that is probably the most important part of your plan anyway. But at the same time, never forget your own plant or your own facility, and make sure that you go out into the world with a good performance on your own side before you start making changes elsewhere. And with that, Nick, I pass it back to you.
It's good, and the other part of the Fit-For-Watershed is that we haven't really mentioned it, but water issues are obviously dynamic as well. They can change very quickly, and it's important to have that local ownership and local monitoring of conditions, and be able to escalate when something significant does change, be it regulations, weather, infrastructure, etc. So that's good. That concludes our presentation. I hope each of you, found something interesting, gathered a few nuggets. That's always the goal of a webinar like this. On this last slide here, you see some references to additional information. This presentation has been recorded and will be available to everybody that signed up. So I would encourage you to go look at the three companies involved here. There's a lot more information about what they're doing, and it's continually updated as well. I think with that, Victoria, we're going to open it up to a few questions here. I think all four of us are glad to stay on for a bit as people have some questions. I know a couple have been exchanged already in the chat. And then we're also all more than happy to take this offline and have discussions as well after the webinar. So, Victoria, do you want to lead us through a few questions here?
Great. Thank you, Nick, and thank you to all of you for an interesting presentation. Okay, so we'll do a couple really quickly because I know we're running over time. So the first one is for you, Ron, and it says, I see that Heineken is a member of the CEO Water Mandate. Have you used the Water Action Hub established by that body to facilitate collaboration in a watershed by companies, governments, NGOs and communities to solve water-related problems?
I must say not yet. We explore possibilities for the Water Action Hub, but as we said, we prioritized our sites, and we start working first in 23 sites. And at the moment, we have not yet, say, a geographical overlap with areas where the Water Action Hub is active. So my answer is no, not yet, but that may come in future.
Sorry, carry on.
No, I'll continue.
Thank you, Ron. Okay, the next one's for you, Todd. Is Cummins substituting water-intensive manufacturing processes with low or zero water use, such as dry cutting, for example?
So we have not gotten into dry manufacturing from a cutting process, but we are looking at opportunities to do that. We have traded off a number of lower water use processes, such as air-cooled chillers and dry paint curtains, things of that nature, particularly in water-scarce areas. I think there was a good question on as well that in many cases, there are cases where these technologies, such as the air-cooled chillers, have increased energy demand, and how do we analyze that? And that is certainly a challenge, and we try to take a holistic perspective, looking at the cost implications, but also looking at the risk implications that are present in areas. So we are much more likely to make this water decision that may have energy impacts in some of these water-scarce areas where there are very real business continuity and community issues associated with higher water use in our operations.
Thank you, Todd. And I think this better be the last question since we're running a bit over. And it's more open, so we can have a few answers to this. So someone asked, in which way does voluntary reporting schemes on water footprints, such as the CDP water, motivate a company to invest in water management projects and reduce water footprint of the company? And what is the role of ranking your suppliers in such schemes? So, Ron, do you want to go first?
Yeah, can you then repeat the question? It deals with water footprinting and?
So it's what do voluntary reporting schemes? In which way do voluntary reporting schemes motivate a company to invest in these water management projects?
I don't catch it.
So how do voluntary reporting schemes help companies sort of motivate them to actually take action?
Well, we report both to the Standard Jones Sustainability Index and the CDP Water. Is that covers your question? Or?
Okay, sure. Todd, do you want to answer it as well?
Well, I see some of these voluntary reporting as a very useful from a standpoint of helping guide where interests and also some of the broader issues are going. So for us, the nature and the direction of the questions and the evolution of those over time is helpful. In terms of driving investment, I don't know that they specifically do for us. We had launched our water program motivated by seeing that water was becoming a bigger issue for the communities where we worked, and also an exposure that we faced. And so we're really driven by an understanding of that connection to our business. But we do certainly support the transparency and making it clear, how we're working in that segment.
Thank you, Todd. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today, but I'd like to thank all the presenters and everyone who's joined us for the webinar. And I know a few of you have asked questions that we haven't quite got around to, but you can always continue this discussion on the 2 Degrees platform, and I'll try and get one of the presenters to answer. The recording of the webinar will be archived on the 2 Degrees platform as well, and I'll send all of you the link when it's live. I hope you found today informative and enjoyable. And if you're interested in cutting water costs in the manufacturing industry, we have a webinar on just that next Thursday, 3rd of July. More details of this can be found online. So thank you, and I hope to speak to you all again soon.
Great. Thanks all, and thanks 2 Degrees.
Yep.